Okay. So welcome everybody. This is the Scholar Strategy Network of New Jersey, Philadelphia chapter event on influencing public policy by influencing policymakers. My name is Julia Sass-Rubin. I'm a professor at the Blaustein School at Rutgers, which is on strike, but this is not a Rutgers event in case you were wondering. And I am the co-lead of the this chapter along with Susan DeJarnett. Susan, who is a professor of law at Temple University, where I think graduate students were recently on strike, if I'm not mistaken. So that is a uniting feature for us. I would also like to introduce our chapter fellows, Dr. Stephanie Walsh, you wave, there you go, who is at the Heldridge Center at Rutgers, and Lauren Nolan, who is a PhD candidate at the Blaustein School. Lauren, there you go, okay. And just a few words about the Scholar Strategy Network. It's a national nonprofit organization with 36 chapters dedicated to building a nationwide culture where research regularly informs policy at every level. So SSN does many things for those of you that may not be members already. It connects scholars to civic leaders and organizes scholars to testify before congressional committees and to make research, in order to make research matter to policy. It helps scholars develop media strategies that make a difference in policy debates and strengthens the role of research in public discourse. In the states, it builds communities where research systematically informs policy by connecting local researchers with key policy players, kind of like what we're doing today. And it does trainings to give scholars the tools to map the policy landscape and build relationships with leaders who work on the issues that scholars study, to empower them to be players in the policy debate. So you can see how all of that connects to today's event. If you're interested in, if you're not already a member and you're interested in joining, we'll put the URL in the chat. It's very easy to do. And I do want to introduce Dominic Domer, if you could just wave so folks can see you. When not that large of a group, I think they could probably see you, but anyway. And Dominic is the Director of Communications, and we might be joined by Pam Metz, who's the Director of Chapter Development, and by Danielle Mulligan. So in case they join us, just a heads up. I also wanted to say that this is my last SSN event. We have 3-year terms as co-leads, and I wanted to introduce the person who will be taking over, which is a really wonderful thing. Thank you, Stephanie, for putting the URL in, which is Professor Andrea Hetling. Andrea, do you want to? Yeah, there we go. So in the fall, she and Susan and Stephanie and Lauren will be rocking. Okay. So influencing policymakers is obviously a key part of the SSN mission, and to influence policymakers, or excuse me, influencing public policy, and to influence public policy, you have to influence policymakers. So today's event is to gain critical insights in how to do that from 3 professionals who have extensive experience working with policymakers at the federal, state, and local levels. After I introduce them, I will moderate the first part of the panel, which will consist of Q&A that we've already shared with them. And then Stephanie will moderate the second part of today's panel, which is the questions that you'll submit. And you can submit questions at any point during today's event through the chat, and they'll go to Stephanie and to me. So with that, let me introduce the panelists. So James G. James is up there in the middle of my screen. Anyway, there you go. Thank you. He is the founding principal of Stono Public Affairs. Previously, James was the chief of staff for New Jersey Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman, who is my congresswoman, and I love her. He helped create the Congressional Caucus on Black Women and Girls and the Emergency Task Force on Black Youth Suicide to draw attention to overlooked issues in the community and to amplify Congresswoman Watson Coleman's voice. Prior to her becoming a congresswoman, James also was her chief of staff when she was in the New Jersey Assembly, where she was also a mover and shaker. Aside from working with Congresswoman Watson Coleman, he has served as deputy chief of staff in the Governor McGreevey administration and as a senior advisor to the Corzine for governor, Booker for Senate, and Murphy for governor campaigns. And he's worked on many other state, local, and federal races across the country. And James basically knows every person, I think, in the world. So the next person is Brett Schaeffer. Brett, do you want to, there you go. Brett is the policy analyst for the Senate Democratic Appropriations Committee and its chairman Senator Vincent Hughes. Brett specializes in education policy from early childhood education through higher education, with a particular emphasis on education finance policy. Prior to joining the state Senate, he was the Policy and Communications Director for the Education Law Center of Pennsylvania. And our third panelist is Alison Stohr. Alison, there you go. Alison is Chief of Staff for Council Member Kendra Brooks, who is Philadelphia's first Working Families Party council member. In this role, she has led a number of legislative and policy initiatives, including Council Member Brooks' work to protect community gardens, which are currently encumbered by private liens, and the passage of the Renters Access Act, which supports fair access to housing by creating uniform screening criteria for applicants' rental and credit history. She also works to advance ongoing advocacy for progressive city revenue, including a call to end the 10-year property tax abatement and for large nonprofits to make pilots payments in lieu of taxes. So those are our very accomplished panelists with a lot of very diverse experience in different levels of policymaking. So let me begin by asking them, and by the way, I have muted everybody just to facilitate a more conducive environment. So I just wanted to give you a heads up on that. So let me start by asking the panelists to describe more fully their current and prior roles in advising federal policymakers at all these different levels that they've worked at. And we can start in any order. I mean, I guess I can start with James, since you've had the federal experience, and then we'll move from there. If you want to just expand a little bit more on the work you've done.
So
go ahead, please.
So I primarily was a campaign guy, masquerading as a staffer most of my career. So in between campaigns, I would go inside and work on actual government. And then in about 2 years ago, I left the Congresswoman, and started my own lobbying firm, originally just to, because I had a big client that wanted me to start a firm, and that's how they wanted to pay me. And then I got opportunity to be of counsel to a larger lobbying firm in DC. So I do both. I have my own firm in New Jersey, and I'm of counsel to a firm in DC that requires me basically a 1 night or 2 nights a week I'm in DC. And I guess to answer the question, so as a campaign staffer, you're obviously advising legislators and policymakers. I think so, even more so now. I have about 26 clients, and on various levels, I am sort of either serving as an usher, meaning sort of like showing people where they sit or where they want to sit in government, sort of ushering people through the process. I have a lot of great clients like the ACLU and the Arnold Foundation and the Soros Foundation, people who are trying to impact public policy from a progressive perspective. And then I have the city of Newark trying to get grants for the city of Newark, and Kane University and NYU. So I sort of serve as a person that sort of helps people navigate the ways of Washington, and how people get grants, how they get earmarks, how they get their issues to bubble up to the surface in public policy fights. And so that's sort of how my job has changed from the inside, where my job really was to try to figure out how to annoy Republicans as much as possible. And now my job is sort of to help people navigate the system. So.
Thank you very much. And I just want to give Brett and Alison the same chance. And then I'd like all of you to speak about your experience in terms of working with research and researchers. So Brett, we'll just go federal, state, city, if that's okay.
Sure, right. So as Julia said, I work for the Pennsylvania State Senate and for the Appropriations Committee. Most of my work centers on education policy, but I think generally, like, the same principles kind of apply across topics. There's some, there's probably some particulars, but otherwise I think it applies across different areas of study and research. And, my role is essentially to work on developing legislation. I work closely with different researchers and academics doing that, and will, take any, sometimes it takes 18 months, sometimes it takes 8 weeks. It just depends kind of on the issue and what we're trying to look at. The other piece of my job is once we are in legislative session, our committee obviously is the last stop before a bill gets to the floor. So every bill that comes through our committee gets a fiscal analysis. And so that's the other part of my work, is that anything that touches education requires some kind of fiscal analysis from myself and our office to inform our members on the cost, or in some cases revenue, behind each bill. And then, separately from that, there's, I think, to James, I think James kind of has it right, and that like sometimes the role that we play, and in my case, it's a little bit more informal, is talking to folks about sort of how to navigate, right? And we'll get into this, it sounds like, in the next couple of questions, but like, how do you get your research, how do you get your work kind of woven into the process? And so there is, what I would say sort of more offline discussions about that, and, having meetings in different coalitions and sort of working with folks in that way as well. So I'll just leave it there. And like Julia said, maybe we'll come back to that later.
I can promise we will. Absolutely.
Okay.
Very much, Brett. Alison?
Yeah, I think I am new to government, especially compared to James and Brett. The closest I got before this job was a brief stint at Research for Action, an education research organization, where I worked in their policy shop for a little while. And now as chief of staff, my job is really to figure out how to respond to people like James who are contacting our office with different, legislative proposals. And because we are, Kendra came out of an education advocacy background, it's a lot of folks who are working on the ground in advocacy who are reaching out to our office. And a lot of our job is trying to, create our own legislative agenda, figure out how to build coalitions, because Kendra is the only person in her party in City Hall. So figuring out how to build coalitions to get enough support for any legislation that we're proposing. And then also a lot of the job is figuring out how to respond to other legislators' agendas and bills that they are proposing, which, can take up more time than I would like it. But that's pretty much my job.
So while we're with you, why don't we just continue in terms of, can you speak to the kinds of interactions you have with researchers in any aspect of what you just described? What are those relationships like? What are the interactions?
Yeah, I think it's particularly for us with like some long-term projects that we're working on. The one that comes to mind is a lot of our housing work. And we've done that in partnership with folks who are sort of a mix of like academics and also practitioners. So Rashida Phillips, who's at PolicyLink, has been like one of our main collaborators. She really helped us draft the Renters Access Act. So that's helped informed a lot of our work. I know we're also working with a professor at Penn who helped draft a model lease, which was sort of a suggestion that came up after he kept complaining about leases being bad. And so there was a suggestion that he create a model lease that, the city can then post and landlords can use. A lot of it is just out. We're also working on rent control, which will be, a multi-year project, and just reaching out to folks who have expertise in the area to try to educate ourselves, and then also figure out how to best educate other council members, especially in a topic like rent control, where people have very intense knee-jerk reactions to those words, and figuring out how to kind of brief them so that they're up to speed on kind of, what it looks like in different areas and what's worked in other cities and stuff like that.
Got it. Okay. I'm coming back with more specific questions about all of that. But Brett, do you want to speak a little bit to the kind of relationships you have with researchers in your capacity?
Yeah, so we had pre-pandemic, we had a formal relationship with Temple's graduate program in urban education. And we hosted graduate students. They would get credit, and we would sort of establish a research project in advance. They would also spend some time in our office. And we would, again, kind of work with them very closely. It was often students who were pursuing their master's, but also some PhD students as well, coordinated by the professor in that case. And we were like sort of halfway through that when COVID hit. So I can't report on the outcome really of that because it all just kind of stopped. And we haven't been able to restart it for various reasons about the academic politics at Temple, which I won't bore you with. But that was the sort of the most formal relationship, and it was, it was pretty structured. Like I said, they were getting credit. We were, they were getting a stipend from us. It had potential to be great. But we'll have to see about trying to revive that. And then informally, all the time, Alison mentioned Research for Action, which is a great organization in Philadelphia. If folks are not familiar with it, they do national work, but we often work with them. Again, I feel like we're very lucky because we have other entities here. There's something called the Policy Lab at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. That is also a resource that we've used many times for issues that kind of overlap between education and children's health. So again, I think we're fortunate that there are a lot of resources available for us, and we try to take advantage of them as often as we can.
Okay, so I'm going to come back after James speaks to ask more about what those interactions look like, and et cetera. So just to give you a heads up. So James, what about you? In your many different roles, what interactions have you had with researchers? You're muted.
When
We
I was
had
in
to say that at
Congress,
least once, right, on the call.
when I was in Congress, we would try to engage researchers to try to get us closer and closer to data-based decision-making, which is at times in elected offices is an alien concept. People operate, Alison used the term intent and knee-jerk. That is more the norm than data-based research driving what people do legislatively. People do with politics, the interaction between politics and policy is that they respond in a way that gets the attention of newspapers. Politicians care about votes and campaign dollars. And oftentimes the anecdotal is much more powerful for getting policy or legislation drafted than data. And so I'm really hopeful about what you all do. What we did in Congress was we would pull together people who were advocates to get them around together in some semblance of an organization. That's how we got the Congressional Caucus on Black Women and Girls together. That's how we did the symposium on Black youth suicide. We got researchers together. Matter of fact, the entire Bonnie Watson Coleman did an emergency task force on Black youth suicide and mental health. It got passed through legislation. How it was motivated, it was a friend of mine. It gives me an opportunity to give a shout out to my Morehouse brother, Henry Coleman, who's on the call. A buddy of mine from Morehouse was a researcher at NYU. He also is the grandson of Frankie Beverly, who's a famous soul singer. And I wanted tickets to Frankie Beverly and Mays concerts for the summer. So I called him to come down. He said that he needed a reason to come down. So we put him on a panel about mental health. And in that panel, he talked about the fact that one of the things that kept him up at night is that kids were dying between the ages of 8 and 12 by suicide. And they couldn't figure out why. And literally from that conversation, we built a task force of researchers from around the country. A lot of them were African-American researchers or people who are working in African-American communities to try and talk about what does the leading research say, and what do you need to do to try to impact this problem. Ultimately, we found that NIH hadn't done a lot of studies, hadn't made a lot of dollars available for people to research this issue. And ultimately, we did a series of interactions over the year, basically field hearings in various members of the CBC's districts, so Black members from around the country, found that this was a big problem everywhere, and got people to advocate for more NIH funding around youth suicide, and particularly Black youth suicide. And so I think that getting a lot of people are just like me, right? They're just campaign people who suddenly find themselves in charge of an office in government, and they need your help. They need you to suggest this sort of thoughtful process to get to data-based legislation, as opposed to, legislation that's motivated by trying to get on TV, which unfortunately, if people are honest, that's really what drives most of what happens. People are trying to get a newspaper article. People are trying to get a TV camera. And so they introduce the most titillating, the most reactive piece of legislation. And, as researchers, what really works may not be what you assume works. It may be the exact opposite. And so having conversations with people who study an issue before you introduce legislation is really vital. So that's how we did it. And I would encourage you to encourage other people to use you to do it that way, because I think we benefit more when it's research based.
Okay, so let me follow up on that. You mentioned that you identified this problem accidentally almost, right? And that you found all these researchers. How did you identify which researchers to work with?
So after we engaged, we talked to Dr. Lindsay, who ironically he was running a mental health institute at NYU, is now the head of the School of Social Work, the first African-American to be head of the School of Social Work at NYU. But he helped us identify a number of people. Then we went and looked at research. We looked at actual journals and reports, and found interesting studies that people had done. Ended up getting, we had Dr. Monica Morris, whose name is now Dr. Monica Cousin. She had studied the fact that more Black women were being penalized with in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension, and the impact that out-of-school suspension had on self-esteem and mental health. And she felt that we should figure out and the relationship between in-school school suspension and ultimate interaction with the criminal justice system. And, she sort of brought to light that there's a relationship between, first of all, that there is a bias that a young Black girl culturally, what she does seems suspendable. When someone else does the same thing, they call their parents. The difference is that the end result is this young Black girl is then forced to be home alone for 3 days, and the potential for subsequent problems, rape, involvement with drugs, the things that can happen as a result of that. Her research basically said you should not suspend someone outside of in-school suspension. You should keep that person coming to school, and it had all of these other impacts. And so I think we did a lot of research and found interesting things to bring light to. Politicians have the unique ability to, elevate conversations, whereas you may be writing most fantastic reports that nobody ever reads. But if, AOC talks about it on CNN, it'll be elevated. Next thing you know, more people are talking about it. And so I think that using each other, using researchers, because you've done the due diligence that your profession requires, and using the attention that politicians can get, really works well together.
Yeah, we agree, which is why we're doing the panel, right? So, okay, so Brett, I guess same question in terms of how did you identify researchers to work with? How did those relationships get formed? You explained about the interns. That's a very specific thing, right? But just more broadly, when you need data, how do you go about identifying people who might be useful in terms of research?
Sure. Yeah. And I think James touched on it a little bit. I mean, I'm reading different journals and reports all the time, trying to stay on top of things. So, that's one avenue where I will see something and then follow up on that. I think in my role as someone who kind of focuses on a particular area, after a certain number of years, you just start to know, right? It's the same people, right? Everyone's in this field. You see them at all the conferences. You read their work. It becomes a pretty narrow universe. And so you end up talking to the same folks pretty regularly. Again, just based on kind of experience in a particular area of policy over time. So it's, I don't think there's a secret sauce there.
Because you're more focused.
Yeah.
Okay. And then there's Alison, who's got all kinds of issues, right, that the city encounters, and it's a very different. So Alison, how do you identify researchers? How do you connect with their work?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of we talk to one group of people and say, who else should we be talking to about this? And they connect us with other people they know who are working on it. So a lot of times our initial outreach would be to like a legal services group like Community Legal Services, right? Because they do, especially in housing, they do a lot of work in housing. And then they will tell us, oh, you should talk to these people because they're doing this research, or these people have been working on this. So I think a lot of it is we have kind of an initial group of folks that we reach out to when we have questions, and they kind of connect us to a larger network of people who are working on a specific issue.
And the initial group of folks are just folks you've developed relationships with and you trust, or do you go to, depending on the issue, you have you go out and you find the people who are already influencing policy, or how do you identify those initial connections of who to trust to tell you who to go to?
Right. I think it's some of both. I think some of it is an example I can think of is in Philadelphia recently, a woman was shot while being evicted, and it brought up all of these questions about the landlord-tenant office, which we knew was a problem. But kind of like James said, it's like, well, now there is attention on this. So it makes sense to take this work that's kind of been like sitting around, and we've been like, oh, we would like to do this, but we just don't have capacity. But now's the time to work on it. So our initial outreach is to Community Legal Services, because they have been working on this, and they will connect us to other people who have been kind of doing work in that area. Sometimes if it's so, like this one is a super Philadelphia specific issue, so it's like you have to know the ins and outs of how municipal court judge appoints the landlord-tenant office. And then for other, I mean, some of it is just like a Google search of figuring out I don't know how people lived before Google, but
Right.
A lot of it is, just like what's out there.
We lived
Right.
before.
Did you say we read before Google?
We did. We did live before Google. I know it's
You did. I believe it. I mean, I did too, but it is just hard to imagine the amount of information that you can find so quickly by doing a Google search and seeing, what's out there, and, being internet literate enough to know like what is a reputable source, what is something that I can reach out to. And I will say, people respond to your emails when you're writing from an email from like phila.gov or from an elected official's office in a way that has never been my experience in any other job that I have had, which is a nice perk. But yeah, a lot of it is just, I think a lot of our jobs in government is figuring out who the right people to be connected to are to get things done. So it's a lot of just asking people, and you have trusted people who you ask, and they'll connect you to a person who will connect you to a person.
So it sounds like it's a lot of networking from your standpoint. And if I'm thinking as a new researcher or a researcher who doesn't already have a relationship with policymakers, I have to establish networks and get myself into Google in a really serious way. I mean, what would you advise someone who's a scholar who's not already working with the three, with the range of legislators that all of you have worked with, to make that connection? Can they reach out to you directly? Is it a policy window thing where if you're not working on this issue and they reach out, it's just like pointless? Or, where do you start?
I do think figuring out who is working on the issue that you are researching is really important because there are so many issues. And yeah, knowing that this person has done work in this area, is interested, and, I do think that most elected officials, if it's something in their wheelhouse, they would be interested enough to at least like have a staffer meet with you and talk to you a little bit about your research and what's happening there. But it does have to be like, if someone is emailing us about, I'm trying to think about, like, I don't know how we need, I'm just something that we're not super focused on in our office. I would probably be like, have you talked to this other council member about this? At least in city council, everything is very territorial and people have sort of marked their areas that they will be working on. And so I have a good sense of what we would be able to lead on, what we wouldn't be able to lead on. And I'm happy to tell somebody, you may want to reach out to this council member and see what happens.
So if
But I
someone
do
reaches
think
out to you by email, you would respond. In other words, if an academic
I would, yeah, I would. I will say that I may not be our office feels very strongly that it is our job to be responsive to people who reach out to us. So we respond to emails from whoever emails us, and very rarely will we not respond to an email. But I know that that is not the case for every office. But I think most people do try to get back to folks who are reaching out to them.
do people send you articles or policy briefs, or what kinds of things are you getting from academics?
I would say, I don't think we've had a lot of
Papers.
we have not had a lot of like cold outreach. We get plenty of ideas from constituents who have, a 10-point plan on how to tackle gun violence that they've put in an email that's in 16-point font and all bold and all caps. But rarer are we getting an email that is like, hi, Councilmember Brooks, I know you work on this, work in this area. I've recently, completed this study and I'm interested to talk about how we might be able to implement something policy-wise. That would be really exciting to get, because I think we're happy to partner with folks who, have research to back up what we're working on. But it doesn't happen that much, at least to me. I don't know if it's different for Brett and James.
We're going to find out. So
Yeah.
if someone reaches out to you with something like that, is it better if they don't attach a whole bunch of stuff to it and they just kind of do a more short and specific outreach explaining what they're doing?
I think ideally if there would be like a 1-pager attached so that you could get a sense of what the research is about, and then hopefully like have a meeting and talk more about what's going on. I am jealous of James and Brett, who have time to read lots of journals and stuff. I do not have that much time. So keeping things, as kind of like simple and straightforward, I think is beneficial, at least for that initial outreach.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, Brett, how about you? How would people, what is effective in terms of someone who doesn't already have a working relationship and wants to communicate their research to you or others like you?
Yes, I mean, I think the way, I'll speak about sort of the state legislature. So, find the issue, find the committee that deals with your issue, and then connect with the executive director of that committee. So, there are, and again, that's both chambers, right? So Senate, House, there's going to be a banking committee. So find who the executive director is of the banking committee. And if that's where your research is, about micro lending, then you should be reaching out to that person. Both the chair, the majority chair and the minority chair each have an executive director. So, reach out to each person there and share that research. Again, a generic blast is probably not great, because like if you email me about micro lending, I might find that personally interesting, but I'm not going to do anything with it professionally. It's just I'm not going to read it because I have too many other things that I do have to read. And then it's just what you said, right? It's like establishing relationships. So kind of, send kind of smaller bites. Do not send them your entire thesis. Like that's just going to not get read. Like,
No
just
dissertation at all?
don't send the
Not even a short one?
dissertation.
Oh,
Don't send the dissertation. I don't know if that needs to be said, but I thought I'd say it anyway. You know, just like small bites, you know, and they'll be able to kind of take little bits and then come back for more if they want. The other option too is like, well, I'll say two real quick things. So in Pennsylvania anyway, each caucus, so, you know, 2 chambers, 4 caucuses, each caucus has a policy committee, which does the whole thing, right? So like, you find the chair of the policy committee for each caucus and connect with that executive director. And then that's like where you can send them pretty much anything, because their job over 12 months is to do any number of hearings. And that's often where you would then get invited to speak or submit testimony, right? So their calendar is a little bit different than the legislative calendar, because they're meeting year round. And again, they tackle every issue under the sun. And that's just like totally dependent on who the chair is and what their interests are. You know, and then the last thing is like, for us, there are like national aggregators, I guess I would call them, or consortia. So like there's something called the Education Commission on the States, which just collects research from all over and just basically categorize, in my case, they collect education research from all over, and then we'll categorize it into different topics. And so then you just go there and like you see sort of a grouping of different research. So those I'm sure exist in each kind of category of research. I'm sure there's some version of that out there and you know, in the world for each topic area. That's like a little bit of a side note, but thought I'd share it.
so what I'm hearing is somewhat consistent with what Alison said in terms of how much to share. So something along the lines of like a 1-page overview. Is it, here's my, and this is, I guess, a question for all of you, but we'll start with Brett. Is it, here's what I've discovered and here's the policy solution? Or is it, here's the kind of work I've done. If you're working in these areas, give me a holler.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more like a breadcrumb approach. Like you want to kind of lead them on. Like, again, I think you have to kind of get the interest. So like an interesting data point, you know, that you can share, whether it's, you know, a 1-pager that has like, you know, a couple data points, a chart, a graph, something that's an initial hook, and then share additional data that eventually lands you to some policy solution ideas. But I think the skipping ahead a step, right? I think there's some of that just, I think you need to bring them along a little bit.
Okay.
That's my sense, and that's kind of been my experience.
Okay, thank you. James, given that you've seen this work at both the state and federal levels, can you speak to this issue of how would someone reach out and try to shape or get you engaged?
I think it's important for people to pay attention to the values of elected officials. And that's not hard, that's not easy to do, right? And so we found, I worked for a superhero. Bonnie Watson Coleman's an absolute superhero, right? So we figured out that there was we had a bent, right? There's certain things we believed in, and we kept finding that young people who work in politics, by the way, Congress is run by 20-year-olds, if you didn't know. And left to their own devices, young people will just gravitate to shiny objects. And I kept getting staffers bringing me stuff that are absolutely against everything we believe in, until I realized that we had staffers who had gone to Morehouse and to Howard and to Harvard and to Yale. They were smart and they had on pretty suits and pretty dresses, but they didn't know what to believe. And so Bonnie and I sat down and we did what she calls a mission statement. I don't know if it's a mission statement, but basically it was, don't bring me shit that violates this because it's annoying to me. So we had a list that said, we don't believe in monetizing justice. If there's a bill that says that you can get out of jail if you pay for a thing to go around your ankle, then you can get out of jail. We don't support that. If you if you have a bill that does not give people the right to access to the courts, we don't believe in that. We believe people should have access to the courts. If you have a bill that emphasizes and makes segregation worse, we're not for that. So what it did was give young people an ability, a checklist to go through and say, if it hurts the environment, we're not for that. If it hides your hand on how to manipulate poor people, we're not for that. For you to check to make sure that this bill that this lobbyist gave you does any of these things, you could save me some time by not coming in my office with this craziness. But what it did was give people values, right? So people kept that list and still have that list when they're no longer working for us, because it sort of centered people on what they believe in. So if you as a researcher start to see that there's somebody who has a bent on all their legislation is designed to empower people who are preoccupied with their own survival, people who are fighting the monetization of justice. You know, I was shocked when we got to Congress and Bonnie introduced the first bill that would ban private prisons in America. Like, I couldn't believe that nobody had ever done that before, but we did it, right? Like, it's just, and that came from a bent. It's like what we believe in. Like, we don't believe that you should make money because somebody made a mistake, right? And so I think that you got to pay attention to the values of the people that you have the ability to assist. So given that list, if there was something that you felt met the values of Bonnie Watson Coleman, she's a good person to talk to. And what became difficult for me as chief of staff, I was trying to create opportunities for researchers to speak to the young people in our office. So every year at our retreat, we would call in people and say, hey, tell us what you're working on. Because you may see something from a researcher's perspective that's really in the weeds and nerdy, and we might see a bill in that, right? We did a bill called the Shade Act. We wrote the bill called the Shade Act. And the Shade Act basically came from a conversation. We went to visit a environmental group or institute at Princeton University, and they talked about, they're studying in Trenton, New Jersey, how cities are hotter than suburbs. And basically, they're hotter because when an old ratty house that nobody takes care of gets old and ratty, they knock it down. Well, when they knock the house down, they knock the tree down. You do that 1,000 times, and there's no trees in the city. And so the cities are hotter than the suburbs. And the only difference is trees. And so we made a bill that compensated cities for planting trees. It's called the Shade Act. You get more money if you plant more trees. And the trees should be planted where they're the highest levels of incidence of asthma and breathing related problems. It seems really simple, but it ain't being done, right? The Shade Act ain't get passed yet. It's still languishing, and we still have a hotter city than we do the suburbs. And in Trenton, New Jersey, which is very close to Princeton, you could literally see the difference in temperature from Princeton to Trenton because of the lack of trees. And so I think that having an interaction with researchers will allow young people in policy and in politics to have the imagination to figure out a solution based on data. Because if they base it on just what's popular, like somebody getting shot, any kind of legislation can come out of that, right? So I really do think that opportunities for researchers and young policy thinkers to interact is really essential to the republic.
If someone wants to connect with you as a researcher, what's the best way to do that? The Congresswoman gets a lot of emails, right? Her staff gets a lot of emails. And I'm guessing that unlike Alison's earnest effort to connect with everybody who emails, you're not able to do that. So what does someone do who says, hey, Bonnie Watson Coleman, I'm in on this value system. How do you get your information to her staff?
So I think that every staffer for a politician is really on the hook for events, whether they do events or other people do events. So trying to figure out and going to their events is really important. Town hall meetings is a great place to go to meet staff. But I also think that this is just for me, this is just a James G thing. I think that you should offer to do retreats. Like not enough members of Congress do retreats for their staff. And if you do, I think that if you do a retreat as a chief of staff with your staff without researchers, you're doing them a disservice. However, a lot of chief of staffs don't know that that exists and don't know that that's a resource, and maybe haven't been creative enough to do that. You can provide for them, hey, look, I can present for 20 minutes or 30 minutes at your retreat and take some questions about this issue. You know, what should we be doing about bail reform? Or I'm working on bail reform in New Jersey right now. We did a big bail reform basically that said that if you steal toothpaste from CVS, $7 thing of toothpaste, you shouldn't be in jail for 14 months at $28,000 a year on the state. That if you bail is designed to make sure you come back to court, if you steal something for under $200, we should release you on your own recognizance. As a result of that, there's less people in the county jails. Well, everybody's not happy about that. If you are a sheriff officer that makes $60,000 a year, but for the last 8 years, you've made $180,000, and in that time you bought a summer home, you're not really happy that you can't justify your overtime anymore. And so what do? You say that all the crime you see on TV, that's because they're letting all these people out of bail on bail reform. The data says that that's not true. But the anecdotal evidence, every time someone sees a carjacking or a shooting, they go, yeah, that bail reform. That's why all these people on the street. No, people are shooting each other. We got to figure that out. But it has nothing to do with the fact that we are letting people go home who stole toothpaste. And so it's really important for researchers to push people towards data, because absent data, people will manipulate issues to their own benefit.
You're preaching to the choir here. I think the only question is, how do we actually connect with the legislators to do that, right? So in your case, if you're thinking about it from the congressional level, and if I didn't have your cell number, right, how do I reach out and say, and I have not put on any bathroom walls, by the way, in all these years, I just want you to know that. So no worries, it's what friends are for. How do I make that initial connection? How do I let you know that I've got this really great stuff? You said organize a retreat. A, that would take resources, right? And B, it takes a relationship to get the chief of staff or the communications director to take seriously that you're able to deliver on that. So how do you make that initial outreach?
No, I think that's what you've got to engage. You got to get them to do it, right? You got to, whether it's, I'm saying that that's a suggestion that you could make, that you won't do a retreat around your issue, but you will come to their retreat. And one of the things that they can do is to talk about that issue. Or, I would do it on Friday mornings. I would have someone come in and speak to the staff. It breaks up the week. It allows you to have donuts and coffee with the staff and have someone come in and present. I mean, we need smarter people in government.
But how do they connect with you? How do they let you know what they're doing their research on, so you could bring them in on Friday morning?
Yeah, I think you've got to meet leadership. You got to meet people like Alison, and you got to meet people like Brett. It's very important. I think that this initial calling them, trying to set up a time, I think it just really, again, I think it's really important to how the government runs for that relationship to happen. I don't know what you're doing if you're chief of staff and you're not looking for people who can validate data for the legislation that you push. What you're probably doing is just making up stuff like Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Okay, moving along. So would something like writing editorials be helpful, to get your work out there, to let people know what you're doing? Would that, if you're thinking about, how do you make that initial?
What's even better is if you co-wrote it, right? Alison's job is to get her boss's name out there. So if you wrote it with her boss, she'd be more inclined to read it and know it. And then she has to make sure that her boss is aware enough about it so that when people bring it, talk to her about it, she can have a fruitful dialogue. I think that being that creative is really the important thing to do.
Okay. How about
the researcher that politicians think about two things: votes and money to get votes. You got to get in their way somehow in that way.
Okay. Brett, Alison, how about you? How useful is it for academics to get their work out in a public venue like that? Do you, is that something that would be more likely to be circulated and seen, an editorial or something in Governing Magazine, or, something along those lines? If you don't already have those relationships, I think that's the main issue for people, is if you've got the relationships, then it's obviously, you follow up on those. But if you don't, for folks who aren't able to respond to a lot of emails. Would something like that be useful?
Go ahead, Alison.
I think so. Yeah, I think James' idea of proposing to co-author an op-ed is really great. Yes, we are constantly looking for ways to make sure that our work is in the public domain. So anything you can do that makes less work for us is helpful. And I also think writing an op-ed, we do one thing that I don't have time to read journals, but I read the paper. And we read, the Inquirer pretty extensively, and the opinion pages. So I do think writing an op-ed in like a paper that folks are going to read, or your target is going to read, it makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I think another thing to think about is timing of outreach. Like right now it's budget season. And so we don't have time to like dream big really. And, it's like, we're like, white knuckling our way through budget season. But in the summertime, that's when you like have time to really think about what are the big projects you want to work on? What are the big pieces of legislation you want to work on? Even the fall, but there's also an election happening. So just kind of knowing the temperature of whatever, body you're reaching out to and kind of what their work looks like, I think can also help make it easier to kind of get back to folks.
Thank you, Brett.
Yeah, I think I agree that the op-eds are great. All of that is certainly. I would just add, all of you are probably connected to a university, I am assuming. Yes.
For the most part, not everybody, but everybody's doing research and some.
So you all have, every university has a government relations person or a whole team, and they almost certainly know a lot of people. That's their job. So yeah, I would look internally first and say, reach out to that office and say, hey, I'm working on this research. We're going to look at this, this, and this. Who's a good person and, in the state house to talk to about that? And they will certainly have the person. So again, that may be obvious, but, again, worth saying kind of in the forum that like, look kind of in-house first for some existing connectors, right? People who are already going to the Capitol, the state Capitol, or going to DC to do that work, because they will certainly have, they will certainly have those connections.
What do you see from a staffer's perspective, right? What are you looking for from a staffer's perspective when you have an academic reaching out? Are there, is it just the information? Is it the network? Is it policy applications, or does it really depend on the specific situation?
Yeah, I think it's very topic specific. I think we're looking at different things. Obviously, if that person has done other work, I think it's always the same issue, right? If you're new to this field, how do you get started? If you haven't published, how do you get published, right? But always like being able to kind of connect them to some other work. Maybe they've co-authored something as their first piece. Maybe they've been part of other research projects. So, I think there's some of that for sure. I don't get too hung up on this, but, there's also connected to your, if you're a PhD person, who's your advisor? What have they done and what research have they done? And, have they sort of, kind of blessed your work in a way. So, I think there's some of that too, that just show the work that you've done already that has, I guess, some connection there already.
I think that it's important for you to, if you have a shocking stat, that's a good entryway, right? So during COVID, the Department of the Bureau of Prisons let people out who were of age, older prisoners. They let them out of jail. And I was talking to someone, a researcher, and they said to me that they let people out of jail because of their age, their vulnerability, and 87 have come back. They committed a crime and came back. And I said, you said 87%? He said, no, 87 nationally. I said, well, man, that tells me that we've been keeping people in jail too long. If you let people who are over 70 out of jail and only 87 of them came back, then people over a certain age, maybe we shouldn't keep them in jail, right? Like maybe you stop committing crime when you get a certain age, right? Like somebody ought to take that and look at that study. That's a shocking 87. That's a shocking number for nationally. So I think if you have a shocking stat, that's a good place to start for how to change some public policy, or at least to start looking at things differently.
That's a great suggestion. These are all really wonderful insights. I think for folks who haven't done this a lot, it's just very, very helpful to, even those who have, are learning a lot of things. Alison, did you want to add anything to that in terms of just specific things that staffers are looking for or that would grab their attention?
No, I do think kind of that the stats is a good idea. Yeah, no, I do just, yeah, anything simple and sort of like, oh, that will make you double take, I think will probably get folks' attention.
Great. I want to change a little bit. So we don't have very many questions in the chat. I think we've touched on most of them. Stephanie, are there any questions that haven't been addressed?
There are a couple. One is about how you approach getting questions from researchers who are your constituents versus those who maybe are outside of your area, but with really relevant kind of timely research to share.
So who would want to start with that? Alison, I think you mentioned that you hear from constituents with bold, large letters and plans and stuff.
People have a lot of ideas. Yeah, I think questions like questions or like an attempt to connect with a policymaker. Because we also get questions from people who want to interview Kendra for research that they're doing. So I guess I'm wondering which one.
Stephanie?
Any?
I don't have that question, so I can't respond. Stephanie, was it from?
I think from researchers who are sharing their work.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know that I think my answer may be different. Because we are local government, so there aren't a lot of people in Detroit researching Philadelphia. But I think that if there is research that you're doing that informs the work that we are doing, then that is the most likely to like have somebody reach back out and connect with you about it. I don't think we have worked plenty with folks from like New York or other cities that have done similar kinds of legislation, the kind that we are looking to introduce. So I think for us, it's more a matter of like subject matter match than geographical match.
Does it matter if they're a constituent? I mean, do they warrant additional consideration if they're a researcher and a constituent, or are these sort of two different issues and they don't necessarily?
Yeah, I feel like it's a little bit separate just because yeah, I guess when I think about serving our constituents, I'm not particularly inclined to believe it means we need to take a meeting with them about the research that they've been doing. But yeah, I'm sure it wouldn't hurt, but I don't think that it's gonna, put you one over the edge, I guess.
Brett, James, did you want to speak at all to that in terms of Steph, do you want to repeat the question? I'm sorry, I don't have it on my chat. So,
James? Yeah, just if there are any differences in how you approach researchers reaching out to you, if they're your constituents or not.
I don't think that. I think that relevance to what your interests are and sort of consistent with what you're already doing. Obviously, in places that are contentious politically, certain addresses get your attention, right? So it doesn't hurt. But I think that more inclined is looking for unusual allies, right? Stuff that you wouldn't think would happen, data that you wouldn't assume if you have that kind of data, if you have a shocking statistic. if you have a new approach to something that people wouldn't have thought of without your data and your research, I think those are things that really catch people's attention.
Brett?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, I think it's going to be more about the relevance of the work. Certainly if they're a constituent and they, reach out, we'll certainly talk to them, but I don't know that that trumps the other relevancy issue. And I think when James was saying that, I was thinking about, like, in Pennsylvania, sometimes for us, because, we represent mostly Philadelphia and then a piece of the suburbs, that's my senator's district. It's often interesting for us to see research from the rural parts of Pennsylvania, because sometimes that kind of coalition of rural and urban, where you find kind of poverty levels that are similar, even though demographically those places may be different, is often a coalition that can get votes from both sides. So, like, as James was saying, like, if there's something that's like from a rural perspective that comes into us, we may find that more interesting and use that in a way that we might not think of immediately, but again, has some power because it's different and because it then provides this link, this connection to, the work that we've already been doing and to, like, an urban center as well. So that was just like another kind of little note there, but something to think about.
Stephanie, do you have any other?
Yes, we have a couple kind of related about the policy process. So the first is, and I think we could spend a whole nother event on this, but like how policy ideas that are presented to you get translated into draft legislation. The second related question is, what about situations where policy precedes the research? So there's a policymaker that has an idea for a new policy, or more likely when they have to mobilize to stop a bad bill that's been introduced by a policymaker. How do you include research into those processes?
Which one would you like to start with?
I think
Yeah,
it's essential, particularly if you have something that is counter to what people are jumping behind, right? The Congresswoman, when she was in the state legislature, introduced the bill. And I think the more simple, the better a bill is, right? Like, so she introduced a bill that said that every city, every community has to have affordable housing. And that was the most radical thing anybody ever heard. We got so much opposition. Now New Jersey's being lauded for A500, which was the bill number that she passed that said that every community has to build affordable housing. Now it's a housing crisis. It's a big deal. But when we did it, people were like, you're nuts, you're radical, she's too liberal, blah, 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 blah. Now people are like, I went to college, I have an $80,000 job and I still can't afford a house, right? Like, now it's relevant. So I think that, like, we saw that coming through research. We saw the housing crisis coming through research, and that's why we introduced it. New Jersey also was a place that had a practice where you could sell, before A500, you could sell your right to build. You have a responsibility to build affordable housing. You could sell it to another community. So you're Princeton, you don't want to build affordable housing because you don't want poor or Black people in your community. You could sell it to Trenton. And Trenton, as opposed to laying off cops, will take $2 million from Princeton and build it in the future. Well, now it's the future. And so Trenton is super segregated. We have all of the poor people that are in the county because all the affordable housing is here in Trenton. So I think that, like, we need research to be able to predict what's going to happen from something. So equally as important for researchers to tell us, what you're saying isn't true, is also to tell us what will happen as a result of this policy that you're doing. We've researched and seen what happened in the past, and this is what we predict will happen in the future if what you're suggesting will happen. Well, we sure would have loved somebody to say, selling your affordable housing responsibilities will increase segregation and put all the poor people in one area, creating, not only segregation, but a concentration of poverty that is really difficult for you to develop your way out of. We would have loved to hear that in the 80s when we were taking money from other places, right? Too late now. So I think it's really important for you to not just say, hey, your idea is bad, but we've taken a look at your idea and taken it over the next 10 years, and the result of your idea will be this. Do you want that? Because that don't look good, you know? And most politicians are just trying to get to the next election. So they won't care about what's happening after the next 2 years or the next 4 years. So having you there with your research is really, really important.
You're just breaking all my ideals, James. I'm you know, about the American political system. I'm really devastated by this. Brett, Alison, did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly agree with James on that for sure. You know, anything like, especially in the context of trying to kind of beat back bad legislation. You know, we're in the position on the Senate Democratic side as we are the minority party in the Senate. And so, you know, none of our bills get run, first of all, or rarely do they get run. But, you know, often we are in a position of having to put up no votes for the, you know, for the majority, you know, against the majority's bills. And we need often, you know, that kind of analysis that James talked about, that like why this is a bad policy, not just this year, but like what it kind of unleashes in 10 years from now. So yes, that is very relevant. And, you know, we would certainly appreciate all of that research and that work.
Alison, did you want to say anything about either one of those? Yeah, okay, great. I was actually, I don't know, Steph, are there any other questions? I was going to ask about testimony, but if there's other questions about this, I don't want to subvert that.
I have a good kind of broad final question.
Sure,
If you
go
want
for it.
to, so then, do you want to ask yours first?
No, go for it. Because mine's a little bit different. It's about the testimony aspect of.
Okay, so this one is just in the times of animus towards higher education and politics, how can the two sectors better collaborate to strengthen the role of research and policymaking?
Well, I'll start. I did one of these a couple of years ago for someone who was, you know, writing about this issue. And, you know, he was going around to different places all over the country to kind of look at this relationship. And at the time, you know, I mean, look, it's not easy. I mean, there is just so much cynicism. And just just a general campaign by a lot of folks to diminish education, to diminish critical thinking, to diminish research data. I mean, I'm not saying anything new here. Anyone who's been a sentient being in the United States for the last 6 years has come to this conclusion. It's bad. I don't know what else to say. Like, we're trying really hard to kind of build it back. I think one of the things that, you know, that we've struggled with is that, like, what you also get layered on top of that is junk research, right? You've got all these like pseudo think tanky, bogus shell entities that get propped up and created every other week that are just putting out terrible work, intentionally bad work. And, you know, that's the point, right? You have entities that I would just call chaos machines. Like their job is to generate bad information and to send it to legislators. Just constant streams of bad information that they send to legislators, who then read it verbatim in a meeting as if it's real. And that is the reality that we're dealing with. I mean, I don't mean to bring everyone down here at the end, but like, you know, this is the struggle, this is the battle. You know, we'll keep doing what we do and try to be thoughtful and try to, you know, bring good research, peer-reviewed stuff, you know, everything that, like, you know, to check all the boxes. And it is, we are swimming upstream. It's a real challenge.
I don't think you're bringing everyone down. I think that you're pointing to the essential nature of having peer-reviewed real researchers involved in the process. Otherwise, the other people will win, right? You need to have a counterbalance to these strange researchless people who are very loud. I mean, if you are loud and wrong, you get attention. And you need people that are saying, no, this is not true. I mean, there's so many instances in the recent days where just the truth, something that's not the truth, gets out there for so long that some people start to believe it. I mean, that's really what the problem with social media is right now. You used to have someone dumb say something and nobody hears them. Now, all the dumb people can connect on social media and that thing just grows. We've got to figure out a way to counterbalance that with, real peer-reviewed research. So it's like, I think that's really what we're saying here, that we absolutely need you to get in the game. We can't have you just in your institutions learning really important stuff and then talking to each other about it.
How do researchers counter this stream of non-factual stuff that you're getting? How our work isn't necessarily peer reviewed at the stage that we're sharing it with you, right? That has to go through a journal process, etc. So how to differentiate what is high quality and factual from the things that you're seeing if you don't already have that relationship? Is it the fact that you're at an academic institution? Like, what differentiates the things that you trust if you don't know the researcher?
That would be it for me, right? I would assume that your institution would not allow you, and maybe I'm wrong, but I would think that they would be doing some level of checking in that way. And then other stuff is just, blatantly crazy. So it to be true. But I just think that good people have to get in the game. You can't leave it to chance. There's so much that gets moved and pushed for and fought for in Congress that is based on no research, that I think that the counter with research is magical. But I don't know if people in the research business know how magical it is. And I think that, now that I've told you, you should know that the 20-year-olds need to hear from you who run Congress, because they also aren't looking for you, right? Because they just try to get to the next party and reception. That's the other part you should know, that bad people have receptions and they hire people based on what they look like. And so there is a counter attack going on in Congress, right? So anybody here ever hear of the T-Mobile merger? It's T-Mobile and Sprint. T-Mobile hired a Beyonce equivalent as their lobbyist. And every Congressional Black Caucus member who had a Black male chief knew her. You can't tell me that wasn't on purpose. And when I went to my colleagues and said, hey, I think this is going to be problematic. Like, I think Sprint laying off all these low-level workers who work in stores could be a real problem for real estate in urban areas, for unemployment in urban areas. Someone in that dinner meeting that night, it was all chief of staff from CBC members, said to me, have you seen their lobbyists? He literally mentioned, had you seen their lobbyists? So there are other factors that are being used to push public policy. We absolutely need you to be pushing facts, because bad people use every tool at their disposal to push bad things to make it happen.
So we have to get our research to Beyonce and get her to go talk to legislators. Is that really what it comes down to? Okay, that seems pretty doable. I don't know. I'm good to go. I was going to ask you guys what areas of research you wish more academics were working on that you're not hearing about. And I know we've touched on some of this, but what do you feel are like real opportunities that you're just not seeing or hearing from academics about?
I can go first. I think on the municipal level, we think a lot about like progressive revenue And everybody who researches like tax policy and stuff they're coming from a very conservative background. It's hard to find, economic research that is not based in like trickle down economics. So I wish there was more progressive research around revenue.
I have a colleague I have to introduce you to.
Please, love.
Okay, great. Thank you. Brett, James, how about you?
Well, I would say also sort of, again, this is related to the work that I do specifically, but Alison is also involved in this work. There is not a lot of great research on, let me say this carefully. There's a ton of data, but there's not great research on the conditions of public school buildings. And so this was a struggle we had when I mentioned the project we had set up with Temple. That was the project. We were trying to dive into examining some way to show, some corollary between building conditions and outcomes, or building conditions and race, building conditions and, level of poverty. I mean, I think we can all sort of make guesses, right? Like we can all anecdotally, draw those connections. But I think where we struggled was finding actual data to connect all of that. And we had, we had massive data sets. We had like, all these federal reporting requirements around asbestos. We had all like federal student data, but like weaving that together or like doing any kind of analysis, we just kept hitting roadblocks. So if there is like somebody who's out there and who's into that, it would be very well received.
All of this, of course, is like a walking ad for SSN National, because if you have, I can see Pam and Dominic just sitting there going, yes, we can do this. Because if you have these kinds of questions and you're not finding it, they can approach people in all these different chapters and find out who might be working on these issues. So James, how about you? What do you wish folks were researching that you're not seeing?
I mean, I personally think that we got to figure like that. This is just me. I hate the Attorney General. Like, I don't understand what's taking so long. It's like, it seems like at every level, there's violations of the justice, of our electoral laws. And like, I don't understand why we're not, like, there are states who are saying or trying to limit people's ability to vote. There are states that are trying to take away the results of people's votes. Like, at what point is there a federal violation? Like, I would love for a law school to say, Merrick Garland, who I didn't support as a Supreme Court nominee, because I thought he was mealy mouth and not tough enough. And I still think he's the same way. I just want to know, what's the truth? What's the facts about? Like, at what point do you violate the Constitution and the law around voting rights? It's like, I don't know. So that's just my personal thing. I think we don't hear enough from academia about that. Like, at what point that's just personal. But I also think that poverty and exploitation of poor people is an issue that nobody is paying for studies on. Somebody has to study that. I think that there's a number of situations where people are working, playing by the rules, and not able to make it because the rules are set against them. So one group of people makes $40,000, another group of people make $40,000, but because of where you live, your race, there's some charges that happen to make your $40,000 feel more like 28 or 38, and somebody else can make the full 30. So if you live in an urban area, your insurance prices are higher. Your health insurance is different. There's a number of costs related to people that make what you earn a lot different than otherwise. I just learned yesterday that until 1978, the insurance industry charged Black people differently than white people. Well, that hurt me, almost made me cry, because when my father passed in 2018, he was very diligent about insurance, and he made my family more wealthy in his death than it's ever been in our life. And I was thinking, man, that guy had no education, and he left his wife better than I'd leave mine, right? It was motivation. But then when I heard this stat, I'm thinking, imagine if he had been given the full shrift of what he gave, right? So he did really well and was really diligent to paying his insurance bill up until 2 months before he passed. And he still got robbed based on the information I got yesterday. So what do we do as a result of that? That's not reparations, that's just fairness. Like, so like, I just think that no one's looking back to say, how are different people being treated differently, and how do we deal with people who are particularly in poverty, and how their level of poverty impacts their everyday life. I don't see enough of research about that.
What would be the most useful way for you to get those kinds of answers? This is for all three of you. So if you find an issue that you don't already have a network to approach, right? Would it be helpful to have sort of a one-stop where you could say, okay, I'm trying to find data on this, and they could access a whole bunch of researchers that way? Or what would be useful for you? Or would you prefer to work with people you already know and not have to kind of put a general call out for various?
I don't want to dominate time, but there's a group in America that I hate called ALEC, and what they do is they walk around with already made legislation, normally with very attractive half-dressed women, and they give it to legislators, and the legislators just introduce it. And several times in my office, young people came to me with legislation drafted by ALEC because they just didn't know, and they're so kind, they're so nice, and so if you don't know their bent, you could end up introducing it, but you never see the opposite. You never see somebody else from a different perspective, a progressive perspective, research-based perspective, handing someone legislation that says, this has been researched, this is foolproof based on my status as a researcher, this is what should be done. I just think we need a counterbalance to ALEC.
Absolutely. I think there are actually some. So if it was something more general, not necessarily something that there's already a piece of legislation, because ALEC is more from the pushing specific solutions and trying to find problems that they can ostensibly solve, right? But when you're looking for information on something that comes up, there's a policy window. What would be helpful? If is there a way of getting those answers that would be particularly useful? Do you just reach out to your existing networks like you mentioned earlier? Would you feel more comfortable with that? Or would it be helpful to have something that's outside of those networks?
The network is helpful, but really, every year I was in Congress, I went to the Concrete Workers Party because it was a great party. Like, it was steak dinners, it was great music. Like, I don't know what they advocate for, but nobody misses their party. Same thing with Google. Nobody misses the Google party. I just think that we've got to be more creative about how we reach people with ideas. We got to use the same tactics that they use. There's a reason why the Google party is so much fun, because they want to be your friend, and they don't want you to change how they operate. And so I think you got to be creative about how you reach the people you're trying to talk to.
Okay, so academics just need a whole lot of money, basically. I think that should not be a problem. And really attractive people on the front lines. Okay, I think we're good. All right, and with that, please join me in thanking James and Brett and Alison for a really interesting and engaging presentation. And